Well, hello there, partner. Pleasure to see ya. Taking a look here at the civil rights movement a little bit longer. In particular, this lesson 3, we're looking at a shift in vision. Taking a look instead of at civil rights, issues with the economy. So what we're going to be looking at here then is how African Americans in the 1960s shift their focus from civil rights to economic rights. Remember, between 1954 and 1965 really, we see a string of civil rights victories culminating in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So now we need to try and find another focus for those folks who were protesting because, look, even though we have all of those laws that now say we're equal, we know that racism is still out there and racism still exists. So we want to see, number one, what's the biggest problem that still exists? And that answer there is that even with the political victories of the 50s and 60s, African Americans, Latinos, they still suffer economically due to the racism which is kind of stuck in those systems. A simple example, if you take a look at the 1950s and 1960s, what we know and what we see is that African Americans have an income that's only 55% of white families. So we know that based upon the problems of cities, based upon the problems that we see around our country, African Americans aren't going to have the same economic advantages that other Americans have, leaving them trapped in these inner cities. So what we're going to take a look at here throughout this section is how those economic difficulties kind of manifest themselves. What do they look like? What do they do? What do they result in? One of the things I think that's worth looking at here would be unemployment. Between 1973, just after the time we're talking and taking a look at here, in 2012, so what we're looking at is a really long time span as evidence of the kind of institutional racism that we're talking about, racism that can keep people who are ethnic minorities impoverished over time. So here's the unemployment rates for African Americans, and you can see here that in 73 it's just below 10%, higher than the Hispanic rate and way higher than the white rate, almost 6% higher than the white rate. And it consistently stays higher than every other group's, dipping down finally to kind of closing that gap by 2000, but then widening out again with the Great Recession. And in 2012, you can see that it's just as wide, if not wider a gap than what it was back in 1973, because take a look, right? Whites are at just over 6% in 2012, and African Americans are at 14%, 13%. That's a 7 or 8% difference. Here, it's only a 6%, 5% difference if you're at 9%, a little over 9%. So it's actually a worse situation off right now for unemployment rates regarding African Americans and Hispanics than it was back in 1973. So these kinds of institutional problems that we're talking about in the 60s and 70s are still problems today. So this frustration over economies, this frustration over lingering racism, it's going to erupt in riots. And we're going to see riots in places all over the country. The one right here on my pointer is in Watts, Los Angeles. It's the first really big riot that breaks out in 1964. And that's kind of like the lid being blown off the pressure cooker, because we're going to see a series of riots spread across our country over the next 4 years into dozens of cities. We're going to see the death toll increase dramatically across our country in race riots. We're going to see millions upon millions of dollars in property damage. For example, in Detroit alone, $200 million in property damage in the late 1960s. And one of the cities that experiences this violence, this outrage, is York, Pennsylvania. These are some images from York, Pennsylvania and its race riots in the late 1960s. And I just want you to understand kind of what happened in 1969 to lead to the York City race riots, where the National Guard had to be called out in armored personnel carriers, where the state had to actually lock the city down. They actually barricaded whole areas of York City to keep people from getting in or getting out because the violence was out of control. So what happens is that there is a rumor that starts. It's a false rumor that there was a black young man who had been burned, lynched by whites, and that started gang violence along Newbury Street. It started gang violence along Gay Avenue, and at that night we saw two youths actually shoot. Two young blacks being shot at West Philadelphia and North Pershing while talking to a city detective. And you're going to have 6 people wounded in the kind of the erupting gunfire. Other people are injured. There's a curfew that's imposed. The next day, 11 more people are injured by gunfire as violence kind of explodes even more. And then on the 19th, so 2 days after kind of this kind of explosion of violence, a city patrolman, Henry Schott, is shot and killed. A white officer shot and killed, dies 13 days later. The day after that, state police settle in on York City. The day after that, a South Carolina young girl, Lily Allen, is shot by white youths on Newbury Street, and she's gunned down. Dozens of people involved in that shooting. We get to this day, they're still working to try and solve that shooting. But the riots just get out of control. Curfews are in place, and it takes really almost 8 days, 9 days for the city to kind of calm down and kind of back off that riot. So this kind of thing was happening all over America, not just in big cities like Detroit or Baltimore. But isn't it interesting, though, that when we take a look at an America that sees many of the same problems now as we had in the late 60s and 70s with race and with economies, and the difference between white and black economies and white and black unemployment, that we would see race riots again? That shouldn't surprise you, folks. If people are treated unequally, they're going to get angry about it, right? So let's see kind of how this vision continues to shift throughout the end of the 1960s.